School has kicked off, but not before universities changed their rules on protests. Per the New York Times, across the country, universities have enacted a wave of new rules and tightened restrictions around speech and protest. It's all in an effort to avoid a repeat of the disastrous protests during the spring semester. As a reminder, during April and May, nearly 3,000 students on more than 60 campuses were arrested during pro-Palestinian protests.
To give you a sense of the varying scope of the new restrictions, here are some examples. At Ohio State, all campus events must end by 10 p.m. Rutgers now only allows demonstrations from 9 a.m. to 4 p.m. Beyond timing restrictions, many schools are requiring organizers to seek approval at least a few days in advance, or have banned encampments. The University of California and Emory were among the schools that banned encampments on campus. Other schools also now require demonstrations to take place only in specific designated areas on campus. New York University upgraded its language on certain speech. Its new guide says language targeting Zionists could violate its non-discrimination policy. Virginia Tech and the University of Virginia also adopted a policy requiring anyone wearing a mask or face covering on campus properly to show, or on campus property to show valid ID if asked. So a lot of these schools are public schools, obviously a huge First Amendment violation, just a disgusting reaction to protests on campus, the idea that you can only do it during a certain time or in a certain place. You go to a public college. This is your free speech. There's no reason they can enforce you to have a permit to protest. It's a clear violation of students' constitutional rights.
Right. It's been a problem on public campuses for quite some time now that they try to create these restrictive speech zones, as they're called, and they usually end up getting sued by someone, whether it's FIRE or the ADF, Alliance Defending Freedom, because these are unconstitutional. Now, private colleges obviously have a little bit more leeway in how they're able to restrict students' speech, but public colleges have to abide by the First Amendment. They are federally funded, of course, and I agree this is an overreaction. There were cases in the last semester where pro-Palestinian activists were violating school policy, in which they were, of course, apt to be held accountable for that, but to then react by further restricting speech for all students and restricting it in a way that goes beyond what the previous policies were, which were constitutional, is not the way to encourage, I think, student activism, not the way to encourage students to be able to debate amongst themselves about what it is they believe. I think colleges should be a place for free and open speech. The only way that we learn is by challenging ideas that we either are uncomfortable with or confronting ideas that we're uncomfortable with and trying to learn from one another. And when colleges put their finger on the scale and say that they want to clamp down on students being able to do that, it fosters an unhealthy environment, an unhealthy learning environment for everybody.
Yeah, I think the categorization of Zionism, criticizing Zionist philosophies, ideas, their agenda, that is anti-Semitic or that is some form of discrimination is really concerning, because what students are reacting to is an agenda pushed by the right-wing government of Israel, Netanyahu, and his friends for many, many years, which is to control the Holy Land and remove or strip their rights of anyone who is not white and not Jewish. And so that's really what Zionism is about. Criticizing that kind of discrimination and exclusion, being discriminatory in itself, is a ridiculous, convoluted argument for universities to try and make. I would challenge anyone at the head of a university to try and justify it. They can't. This idea that you can't protest against the US government sending weapons abroad, it's just absurd. We saw this in the 70s. We saw schools crack down, and then years later speak about how much they regretted how they treated protesters. We're at this again. And now it's more of the US dollars being spent. And so while we don't have boots on the ground, we are funding the weapons that Israel uses to strike the Palestinians. We're funding the weapons carried by the IDF. We're funding their operations and the health care of people in Israel. So I believe students have a right to protest for whatever reason at any time in any place, especially if it is a public school.
Yeah, I mean, there were instances of anti Semitism in some of the campus protests, but just criticizing Israel or Zionism or the US's involvement in the war obviously does not qualify for that. And there's been a constant conflation of those two things that is, I think, unhelpful for the conversation that people are having surrounding the Israel Gaza conflict. And students have gotten the raw end of that deal. Again, I think that we should be free to push the envelope when it comes to speech, especially on a college campus where the charter of the school is to encourage students to think critically for themselves and to think independently. And too often in the modern campus atmosphere, they've decided that it's their role to impart their view of what students should be thinking rather than allowing them to think for themselves. And then we end up graduating a bunch of people who are very rigid in the way that they think about issues, who don't have critical thinking skills, who are not able to really problem solve. And it's basically gone back to a kindergarten view of imparting basic facts and information, except they're doing it with really large and complicated and complex topics that do need the ability to challenge and to push and to move within and to have some nuance. That hasn't been happening in the university system for a long time.
Yeah, Barnard College, which we didn't mention, and Columbia University has been a huge epicenter of the American protests. Hyde Hall, which is, the now title of a Macklemore song, but was a site of an extreme protest. I have a friend who was beaten and hospitalized. She's in the West Bank now. She's an American citizen of Lebanese descent, but she became the target of harassment from the campus police, from faculty in her school. Barnard is a prestigious school, and this idea that they're forcing, their faculty to not post anything in their classroom. So any signs, any useful descriptors, nothing can be posted that supports one geopolitical idea or agenda without offering something on the other side. The idea that classroom instruction needs to be balanced with this two-sidedness is very ridiculous. It really gets in the way of good teaching getting done at these schools and universities. And it seems like a real desperate attempt to control the narrative. And at the end of the day, when you try and do that, these are young kids. They're just going to get more curious. When you try and tell them what to do, what do young people do? They try and do the exact opposite. So I get that they want to exert control and they want to control the narrative, but at the end of the day, you can't force an idea upon someone when they get so much evidence to the contrary on their phones. They see the impact of the occupation. They see the photos of children being pulled out of rubble. And so this idea that, the United States has a great ally in Israel and they're the most moral army in the world, you just can't force that teaching to students in a world where their source of information is not only their professors. They could use the internet. They can see precisely what's going on halfway across the world, and that's what they're doing. And so the attempt really is desperate, and it really is an egregious violation of free speech. We're going to try and get some of those guests on the show to talk about, what's happened when the Israeli army has fired on Americans abroad partaking in the protests and just visiting the West Bank and some of what's going on these schools, because we can only expect these to ramp up, as classes start and the fall semester rages on.
I do have a point of clarification, if I can, just to understand what you were saying. So you said you took issue with schools trying to introduce balance into classes on both sides of the Israel-Hamas war, but you also think that they're trying to control the narrative. I'm wondering, those two things sound incompatible to me. Wouldn't it be controlling the narrative to only have one side presented?
So the rule in Barnard College is about, physical things posted to walls. And so it's about if you're supporting one geopolitical side. So like Free Palestine as a sign. You have to put like Israel has a right to exist next to it. The rule really makes no sense. But controlling the narrative really pertains to this kind of lawmaking or rulemaking, because these are universities, not the government, around what you can say about Zionists, that is now discrimination. So now you're not allowed to criticize Israel, right? That's
Okay.
the kind of thing that I do believe they are controlling the narrative with that. And this two-sidedness, if you have more students that want to post free Palestine signs, and that makes you upset, so now we have to have equal amounts of Israel has a right to exist signs. It's a ridiculous attempt to control the narrative and make the campus, seem neutral on this when clearly young people support Palestine and are critical of what the IDF has done. And the attempts to, police the language around Zionism, yeah, I think it all is trying to control the narrative to the favor of Israel.
And the rule applies to students, not university officials or professors?
No, it's faculty and staff in official classroom places. So the faculty and staff cannot allow this to be posted. A lot of these rooms are for student groups. So it's really anywhere that's an official part of Barnard College. There's not a lot of clarity among the faculty for what the extent that this applies to their teaching. Will that be next? Right now, all that's written down is the signage.
Okay, gotcha. Thanks for clarifying that. We're going to be back with more on Rising after this.